Once you know what's most important to you and the how a threat actor is going to have that significant impact, that's where you focus your controls. So it's not thinking about controls everywhere for everything, which is what I think we've often done as an industry. Do you have this control, yes or no? How is that control applicable to what I need to protect?
The New Zealand Tech Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, proactive and strategic IT.
Hey folks, greetings and welcome along to the New Zealand Tech Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Spain. Today we have the privilege of chatting with Philippa Cogswell from Palo Alto Networks, Unit 42, Managing Partner of JPAC. Welcome along, Philippa. How are you?
Yeah, doing well. Thank you, Paul. Thanks for having me.
Of course, big thank you to our show partners, 1NZ, 2 Degrees, Spark, Workday, HP and Gorilla Technology. A real privilege to have you joining us while you're visiting New Zealand. Maybe you could give listeners a little bit of an overview of what you do and where you fit into this big wide world of cybersecurity.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give a little bit of background to myself and then also Unit 42.
Right.
So look, I've been in cybersecurity myself now for over 20 years. During that time, I've worked for government, both in Australia and in the UK. I've spent 7 years based in London and ran teams across Europe, Middle East and Africa. I've also spent time in Big Four consulting as well, leading defensive security capabilities. And I was fortunate enough to join Palo Alto Networks 2 years ago now, or a little over 2 years ago, with the remit of leading Unit 42 across Japan and Asia Pacific. So globally, Unit 42 is over 600 people. And look, just for context, Unit 42 is our sort of security consulting, incident response, managed detection and threat hunting capability, all underpinned by our threat intelligence, okay? So as a team, Unit 42 has been around since 2014 and has really expanded from the sort of initial threat research team with an acquisition from Crypsis in the US, a major IR company over there in 2020. And then from there, we've sort of really expanded and exploded our services as well, that we're offering anything from sort of cyber risk management to offensive security as well as that IR. So really think of it, I guess, as assess, respond and transform.
Right. That IR, the incident response, capability, how much of your work is responding to incidents out of what you do?
Unfortunately, probably too much. Look, globally, it's probably somewhere around 40 to 50% of the overarching Unit 42 team. Yeah. So
you'd see a lot of things in a lot of places from your research through to actually dealing with those real world incidents.
Yeah, absolutely. So globally, we respond to over 500 incident response cases a year. So if you sort of think about that as, it's been deemed a security incident that an organisation's assessed that they're not able to deal with themselves, or they need additional capacity or specialist skill sets. So they've brought in, an organisation like ourselves to help respond to. So you gives you a view of just how many incidents are happening per year.
And the types of customers that you would tend to be helping, because I guess across the cybersecurity sector, we've got a whole range of firms that work in incident response, from smaller to global entities such as yourselves. So is it government? Is it big business? What would be some typical examples, without giving out the names, of course?
People are turning to Unit 42 for, as you said, government and big business, right? Because we've got a global team that works as a follow the sun model in incident response. We've got people all over the world able to sort of respond. We've got, ransomware negotiators on staff and these sorts of things. So yes, it's definitely that sort of, I guess, upper tier. It's not necessarily always just Palo Alto Networks customers, but more broadly as well, being called upon. And look, sometimes we might even respond alongside other response companies or transformation recovery companies as well.
Yeah, okay. So one of the things that Unit 42 does is, release a number of, reports that are, they can be really insightful in terms of, what's going on. So, I think a real, benefit to those of us involved in cybersecurity to understand how the landscape is changing. And it seems to be that the ground is moving under us all the time and shifting in differing ways. What are the things that really have stood out in your reports this year compared to previous years?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, just sort of stepping back a little bit before answering that question, I guess as well, when we sort of think about a lot of our reporting that we put out, and we do put out, substantial reporting that we make publicly available on our website, and we've got a whole range of consumers who sort of draw down on that. But I think realistically, one of the important things to understand is, where does our threat intelligence come from? So we've obviously touched a little bit on incident response, and I think the incidents themselves give us a great view as to what happens when an attacker gets into an organization. How did they get into an organization? How did they possibly move laterally through an environment? What were they targeting? What have they taken? So it gives us that sort of internal view to, I guess, a victim organization. Again, and that's useful information for understanding controls appropriate for an organization. But even outside of that, we sort of have this, I guess, I think of it as almost frontward-facing intelligence from our research teams as well, because Palo Alto Networks, as I guess I thought of the company before joining, I thought of it very much as a firewall company, which is true. But over sort of the last 6 or more years, we've done, I think it's 19 acquisitions, right? So we've gone from being a firewall company to a company which does security operations. We operate in cloud security, so endpoint. So again, why I'm telling this is because this starts to build a picture for the sorts of telemetry and information that we're getting back about the sorts of things that we can see. And from, I guess, a threat intelligence perspective, these, I guess, breadth and depths of sources gives us a view as to what threat actors are doing in terms of the infrastructure, who might be some of their victims, and these sorts of things. So it paints sort of a rich picture from, early to, the sort of incident itself and response around that. So that's the sort of, I guess, basis. And I think it's important to understand, sources of threat intelligence ultimately, like how deep and how broad are those threat intelligence sources. And, I touched on it, we negotiate with ransomware threat actors, we monitor deep and dark web forums, we work with, law enforcement and other agencies globally as well. We do have a lot of malware reverse engineers on staff, vulnerability researchers, so it's a really sort of comprehensive piece. But to your point around what are some of the common themes, again, based on all of this information that we're receiving, I think if I look to probably a good point of comparison would be our incident response report from 2025, that we released earlier this year, and that sort of looked at all of the incidents that we responded to over the sort of past 12 months or so. What that told us was a couple of different trends and themes, I think. The first being that what we saw in terms of a real shift was we saw 2024 as being what we call sort of almost the year of business disruption, right? So previously there was a lot of, data breaches and what have you, but threat actors are pivoting more to how do I disrupt organizations, because unfortunately that was becoming what is actually getting, that would get attention. That's where they were looking to get paid ultimately, right? So if you think particularly extortion actors. So for 86% of the cases that we investigated, there was a business disruption or reputational impact to those organizations, right? So that in itself was sort of probably a fairly significant trend. A couple of the other ones that we sort of really observed when we delved right into the data that we had was around 70% of the cases that we investigated had attacks happening on 3 or more attack surfaces, right? So again, exactly. So it's really changed how defenders need to think about protecting themselves. So all of a sudden we're thinking about network, we're thinking about across the endpoint, we're thinking about the humans, we're thinking about those public-facing exploitations. So it becomes far more challenging, right? So in, like I said, 70% of cases, like that's a lot.
I guess that would be, reflective of the sort of organisations that you're looking at, because I imagine you look at, say, smaller organisations, and in most cases they're probably not going to have the same profile as those larger entities that might be more specifically, targeted in that sort of way.
Yeah, look, I think you're right. You look at probably the scale, right? So, a lot of organisations we work with, as I said, are multinationals.
Yeah.
But the one thing I would say is our sort of the digital connectiveness that we have nowadays, right? It means no matter which organisation you are, you either are trying to offer those services yourself, but often smaller entities are actually outsourcing right? So, you've got email providers, you've got IT providers, you've got a whole range of that you're still using similar technologies to give you the outcomes that you need, be it a CRM or something like that. So yes, I think the scale is larger for large organizations, potentially that global footprint as well. But again, we're all using similar sorts of digital technologies, I think.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things we saw in the reporting on recent issue for Qantas was that the issue they dealt with was not within the bounds of their own systems. It was through a partner that their data was compromised, and I think often it's forgotten the importance of not just looking after core systems, but thinking around everyone, be it contractors, partners, and so on, who are maybe connecting in and accessing data and systems, right?
Absolutely. And look, unfortunately, I think almost every organisation I talk to, or at least it feels that way, that third party and supply chain is a major challenge for them to work out how to secure it. And I think ultimately it comes back to how material is that service or that information that they're storing for your organisation. So it's all about sort of the assets and what I'm trying to protect ultimately, to give that organisation the competitive advantage, or keep that business operating, right? So I think that's sort of the key part. But to your point, you're absolutely right. We are unfortunately seeing a lot more of a pivot towards some of those social engineering tactics and not just the traditional phishing, particularly those sorts of targeting of call centres or IT help desks and the like.
And when I think about it, actually, we did see a case recently with one of our companies, mid-size organisations, whereby they had a partner in a particular area, and the partner was hit. Now, because of the protections and so on that were in place for that partner to be able to tap in, we didn't see them be able to get to the organisation that we were working with, but it certainly disrupted that partner, and so that partner wasn't able to deliver their services. So yeah, there's some quite important considerations there in terms of, I guess, expectations and what you expect of third parties from multiple perspectives, even potentially down to if an organisation has a internal cybersecurity awareness training, do all your partners do the same?
Absolutely.
Do the same thing? Are they all on the same page and so on? So
that's right.
It's not easy, is it?
No, not at all. And look, there's a lot more sort of even in the last sort of 5 years here in this region, right? There's a lot more focus on that third-party risk assessment and what have you. Again, like I said, for those organisations, the material suppliers for you, are they holding that same level of standard as to what you would expect as well? So unfortunately, we do need to remember at the end of the day, these organisations themselves are victims to, criminal and the like activity. So, but yes, you're right. Are they doing the things they should be doing and the expectations? Absolutely.
Yeah, so we were kind of, I guess, talking around some of the key findings. Was there anything else to mention at this point?
So from my perspective, I think we do talk a bit about speed, scale, and sophistication, and I sort of tend to joke that I feel like I've spoken about the increase in speed, the increasing in scale, and the increase in sophistication for almost as long as I've been doing this. But I think the reality is, my view is that the time to impact now is so short that it's very different. There is very little time for an organisation to try and identify and contain and eradicate these threats, right? So one of our key findings, to your point, is that I think it was in 25% of the cases that we investigated, the point from compromise of an organisation to exfiltration of sensitive information was under 5 hours. And in fact, I think it was 20% of cases that happened in less than 1 hour.
Super fast.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Exactly right.
Yep.
And as we think about AI, that's only going to get even faster.
Yeah. And we hear of, of some situations where, it's maybe a small amount of data or small access to something small, and it happens in an instant, right? So
unfortunately.
Are there any particular stories you can share, that may have been covered in one of your reports or that you're aware of that give a good example so folks can understand, well, what is it that happened and how quickly, did it happen?
Yeah, absolutely. And because you sort of just touched on a case which sort of spoke a little bit about some of that sort of social engineering aspects, right? I think One of the groups that we track quite a lot is a group called Muddled Libra. It's a subset effectively of a very well-known group, Scattered Spider. Obviously, there's been major incidents, a lot of news headlines globally for this particular group. So we've been, I guess, effectively tracking this group and responding to incidents for probably, I would say, close to 3 years now, or maybe even a little over. But what is interesting is watching their evolution during that time. So they've gone from a group which used to use tactics like SIM swapping. They've now pivoted into a lot of that social engineering, particularly of help desks and call centers, like I said. They've gone from being groups that were sort of, I guess, a little more stealthy with slightly longer term persistence perhaps, to really getting in, having impact and getting out quickly, right? That's sort of, ultimately get paid quicker, unfortunately. So we've watched these groups sort of, and during that time, there's also been law enforcement takedowns of various cybercrime groups, which has also meant broader sort of fragmentation, if you will, do as well. So, some threat actors have claimed that they're leaving cybercrime altogether and retiring. Some have claimed they're going, back to doing DDoS, or some have just, sold off parts of the business. And so it's been a real sort of fragmented piece. But what was particularly interesting about this group is they're English native speakers. So largely assessed to be UK and US based, and more worryingly, fairly young.
Yeah, which is it's quite unusual, isn't it? Because we're used to them coming from maybe less friendly countries, shall we say?
And I think that's where we've always sort of pointed to, right? But unfortunately, I think crime does happen everywhere, right? So it's been interesting to see some of these sort of identifications and takedowns happen, not just of the infrastructure, but some of the arrests as well that have sort of changed that. But one of your questions was the sort of the speed of some of these things and sort of an example. But if I was to give an example, we know of one where one of the cases that we investigated, they went from social engineering the help desk to gaining domain credentials and gaining further access inside a cloud environment in less than 40 minutes. Once they're in that environment, because they had that level of access, they're able to bring in their own tools, their own VMs, set up, stage, do whatever they needed to, move around freely in that environment, right? And exfiltrate data effectively at an alarming rate. What is interesting, one of our other findings was that I think it was in saying like 99% of cloud cases that we investigated, they were overly permissive environments. So as a general rule, it suggests that we still haven't got to configuring and securing cloud environments in particular in a way that we would do the normal traditional on-prem environments or the legacy environments that we think about. So definitely an area of opportunity there for people, I think.
Yeah. And those issues with overly permissive environments, are you seeing that with newly set up environments, or is that more environments that have been around for a while? I guess when I look at different organizations and different, discussions that I have, there are some environments where things have, they've just kind of evolved organically. Different people have kind of come and gone. They've ended up with, all sorts of legacy mess in different ways in terms of, cloud configurations. But those that are maybe starting from scratch, if they're switched on at least, then they're configuring things maybe a lot more sharply than what was common 5, 10 years ago. But if you've got something that's been around for 5 or 10 years, to get that into a good state, that can be a significant challenge. Is that kind of something that you see, or what's the norm?
I think unfortunately sometimes it's probably a bit of a combination of both. And, again, it's not a strict data point as such, but, I would like to think those greenfield builds should be in a better position that we've sort of learnt from the previous sorts of things that we've seen and observed.
They should be, yes.
You'd like to, exactly. But unfortunately, sometimes I think also, we always talk about security being an afterthought or something like that. Perhaps they haven't deployed, tested or configured appropriately, even though they're like, oh, we've just stood it up. But have they done that in parallel? Have they been applying those security configurations in parallel? I think, that's what we're looking for. With the legacy environments, obviously always a challenge as well, no matter what that environment it is. But I think, from where I stand, this is where, when I look at some of the work that my team does is so important because it's actually testing it. So I think as an industry, we often do what we call sort of, almost design effectiveness. We're like, do you have a policy for that? Do you have that control? Yes, 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 that's great. But are you actually testing it? Do you know that control is actually operating as you would expect it to, right? So operational effectiveness. And our red teamers, unfortunately, with their job, and maybe fortunately, because we'd rather that we're using an offensive security professional rather than an attacker doing it, but they get in. They get into all sorts of organizations. They bypass all sorts of controls, be it endpoint, be it network segmentation. They'll find exposures at the edge, just like an attacker does, right? So, like I said, unfortunately, I think there's always they're complex environments. That is the reality. They are complex environments we're trying to protect.
Now, we have a growing startup ecosystem in New Zealand, some really successful companies.
Absolutely.
But there's a challenge for startups, right? So, sometimes there's vibe coding going on, there's hacking together the minimum viable product.
Yep.
All of these things around the startup ecosystem. Is there anything particular that you've noticed that we need to be a little bit more aware of for our startups to consider?
I think and again, it does depend on the type of startup,
Sure,
right?
of course.
Particularly tech startups,
Yeah.
right? I think like any organization, if you have a good idea, you've got to work out how to effectively protect that good idea until such time you turn it into what you need it to be, right? And whether that is IP, whether that's source code, whatever that is, I think that's worth considering from the outset. And like I said, it'd be different between potentially an ice cream shop versus, like I said, the latest and greatest in accounting software or whichever example we want to use, right? So,
yeah, that's an interesting example you've just mentioned on the accounting software front, but we'll pick that up on another episode. Yeah, I think it's one of these challenges, isn't it? That an organisation of scale often has more means to appropriately consider the role of cybersecurity. And in New Zealand, of course, we've got that mix from very small businesses up to bigger entities who might be in software, aerospace. We've got a pretty broad gamut, but it is I think a challenge for every organisation. It's just probably different challenges at different scales and varying abilities to invest.
indeed.
How do you guide the smaller entities in terms of their approach? Because we see entities of every scale get impacted by cybersecurity.
Absolutely.
down to individuals, right?
Yep.
So you're not scot-free just because you're a smaller entity.
No, unfortunately, not the case.
Yeah.
Look, I think I would apply more or less the same principle, whether you're a large entity or a small entity, in terms of, for me it's, and I sort of mentioned it even with the startup sort of conversation, right? What are you trying to protect? From your business context, what differentiates you? What keeps you operating? What is your longer term strategy, right? So, and then also I think about, what is your industry and what is your geography and, what's your company's risk appetite, those sorts of things, right? So I think about initially business context, because what that then tells me is, what do I actually care about? What are those assets, be it data, applications or services effectively, that are actually going to give me differentiated impact in the market, right? And that also applies to government as well. But this is where, for Unit 42, I always talk about us taking threat-driven, so threat-led, data-driven sort of focus, right? Because once you know those things, I think if you know then, I talk about asset profiles often. So is it third-party managed? Is it on-prem? Is it IoT? Is it OT? Is it, these sorts of things? What does the housing for that general asset look like? And the reason I say that is at a very generic view, there's like controls protecting those things. Now, obviously different third parties, yes, granted, but at a high level. And the reason I think about that asset-centric view is because I then think about what are the threats to those assets. So which threat groups are most probable or common, and how are they going to do it? Like, what's going to be their path to get to that asset? And then if they're to get to it, what's the impact? What is the financial impact effectively to an organisation? And look, it could even be loss of life. Now there's, for certain organisations an expanded view, but, am I going to be out of business for an extended period of time? So is there productivity impact? And I can't produce my best ever widget or whatever it is, right? Is there a reputational cost to my organisation, which means my customers are going to move to a competitor? Is there going to be significant replacement costs in some of the hardware or other things, right? And I mentioned it before around business disruption. So, and even more so, you've probably seen a lot of the sort of fines and regulations coming in as well. Like, if this data gets stolen and it's X amount of data, what fine might I be up for? So I always talk in terms of threats on assets with impacts. Once you know what's most important to you and the how a threat actor is going to have that significant impact, that's where you focus your controls. So it's not thinking about controls everywhere for everything, which is what I think we've often done as an industry. Do you have this control, yes or no? How is that control applicable to what I need to protect?
Gotcha. Now, you talked about fines and so on, and we look in New Zealand, we're pretty light in terms of legislation that would put a responsibility on company directors and the like. In most areas, there's a little bit of teeth there around data privacy, but still reasonably light. But one of the areas that is probably evolving reasonably quick is the government side of things.
Okay.
I don't know how well legislation can sort of put pressures on governments, right?
Yep.
And when we look around the world, we've seen probably every government impacted with varying breaches and loss of data. But there's this sort of move, quite naturally, I think, from a technologist's perspective, of increasing government digitisation.
Yes.
Do you think that we're maybe mature enough in our governments yet for that increase in digitisation, and for government entities maybe be sharing a lot more data between them, or is there a fair road ahead to get ourselves into a place where we should all be very relaxed around digital IDs and this broader digitisation of government?
Yeah, look, I think from where I sit, I don't think relaxed is probably the term that I would use. But look, I think the reality is, your point around government and, the use of things like digital identities or what have you, I think, and we look globally, right? The reality is we're there. We are, as government organisations, no matter where you are, intentionally using more and more digital services to provide those to our citizens, to connect, to share data, as you said. Like, I don't see us moving backwards from that. I think so. The reality is, how do we actually look to protect that forward way of thinking, right? It's made individuals, it's made communities far more connected. You also have remote communities here in New Zealand, right? Islands off the mainland and things like that. You can't move away from that need for digital connectivity, but to use that to the best of its ability, you're right, it needs to be secure so you can ensure it's reliable, you can ensure it's safe, you can ensure data privacy. Obviously in the last, probably 8 years thereabouts, we've seen huge change globally in terms of related legislation. So privacy with GDPR and California doing similar, and many other countries. You sort of touched on board accountabilities. There's all sorts of changes around cyber itself, privacy, data governance, AI now as well, and how that impacts things. So I think it's a large group of considerations that actually come into play. When I always think about it, there's sort of being 5 key themes, if you will, that explain why organisations will need to continue to invest in cyber, not just do a cyber uplift, but continue to invest, right? The first is the digital ecosystem, or the digital connectivity that you spoke about. We're going to want to continue to adopt and enhance technologies to allow us to do more and do it faster and more efficiently. Secondly, there will continue to be regulation, compliance, legal frameworks, and they will continue to enhance as well. Again, most of the ones that were even brought out a couple of years ago are already undergoing some sort of revision, right, to say, are they still appropriate? The third for me, I often talk about stakeholders actually, and it's a little bit almost what you're touching on there when you think about governments. Stakeholders are anyone. It's not just your partners or your board or your CXOs. It's also your employees, your customers, your members, your students, whoever it is, whatever sort of organisation you are. They matter, and they have opinions now, I think, about the impact of cyber to them, to their organisations, to whatever, in a way that they haven't previously, right?
Yeah.
We often talk about cyber being one of the biggest risks. The fourth of those 5 points for me is third party and supply chain, and we touched on it because it is such a complex web and it continues to come into everything that we do. And of course, the fifth, which is, where we spend a lot of our time, is that evolving threat landscape, right? Of course, threat actors are going to continue to pivot, change, and evolve.
Now, the role of AI seems to be continuing to evolve.
Yeah.
But what can you share in terms of what's being seen in terms of new threats or threat actors leveraging and taking advantage of what AI can do for them? And I guess the same way businesses want to leverage AI,
Absolutely.
our threat actors are in the same boat, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Everybody is dabbling with, if not moved beyond that when it comes to AI, right? Like, it is a significantly transformational technology, right? Ultimately, I think, we talk about sort of how it can enhance attack generation, how it can enhance, the efficacy. So effectively, how effective is it making attacks far more effective? But then also, the speed and scale ultimately, right? We already spoke about the speed. What's the speed going to be, today, tomorrow, 2 years' time, comparatively? So it's how are we seeing it currently being used? It's we talk about sort of evolutionary rather than revolutionary at this stage, but that's changing very quickly. So I think, like, a couple of examples, I think, we know about phishing emails becoming higher quality, right? That's all well and great, but even stepping back and outside of those and thinking about who are threat actors going to target, right? All of a sudden they can do reconnaissance and discovery and bring vast amount of data together super quickly to actually understand and get better targeted outcomes, right? So more plausible. Understanding attack surfaces, much easier to identify and potentially help build exploits. Right through the attack chain, I think ultimately we can see use cases. And in fact, our research team thought, well, let's test this, right? And so they, in the research lab, they sort of tested and went, well, how quick can we do end-to-end? Not just compromise to exfil, but before that, some of that discovery stages, like I said. And they were able to do end-to-end in 25 minutes. So that's, we're talking 100 times faster. Granted, that's a lab, but it gives a view as to where things like Gen AI can take threat actors, right? So we're already seeing it, like I said, we're seeing voice cloning, we're seeing face swapping, we're seeing a range of different technologies being used. I don't see it going away.
How commonplace is the voice cloning and face swapping types of things? Because we've been aware of these things for years. However, the technology has dramatically improved over the last couple of years, and continues to improve. Probably for the next little while. I'm sure it's still a reasonable pace. Have you been seeing some real world examples on the video side, or is it just on the audio side? Like, how effective are these use cases?
We have seen them through both cybercrime and nation state groups using them. So we spoke about Muddled Libra. They've used some of that voice cloning and sort of, that sort of, I guess, high impact, high pervasiveness tactics when it comes to trying to, I guess, ultimately extort their victims. Really high pressure techniques, not just focused on, executives themselves, but also on family members and things like that as well, which really changes the landscape when, if you're a CEO of an organization trying to decide whether to pay something or not, and your wife's getting phone calls, all these sorts of things, right? So voice cloning, yes. Face swapping, we're seeing, we talk a lot about North Korean IT workers. And again, that's where some of the concerns are really cropping up. The IT workers are really sort of trying to embed remote IT workers into particularly high-tech firms, right? And we've seen sort of some of these, but where you're absolutely right when you talk about, I guess, ultimately the ease or the changes in the technology, the accessibility of these things, right? I remember giving an example of the voice cloning about a year ago when I was here in New Zealand presenting, and it was a piece of research we called Deep Faking Our Boss.
Yes.
And at the time it was Wendy Whitmore. She's our Chief Security Intelligence Officer for Palo Alto Networks.
Yeah.
She's publicly recorded everywhere, right?
Yeah.
So we were able to take samples of her voice and then use that to replicate and demonstrate what we were seeing in terms of some of those call center and help desk phishing attacks, right? Or social engineering attacks. And so it was basically, a voice recording of her phoning up and saying, "Hey, it's Wendy Whitmore, I can't access this and I can't access that." And it's basically, she was trying to put on pressure. She was trying to get help desk to do what they do best, respond quickly, be helpful, and take advantage of some of that human trust element, but ultimately to get the reset of those passwords despite multi-factor and again, demonstrating how threat actors are doing that. When I was here earlier this week in Wellington presenting, I gave an example of some of the face swapping that we've seen as well, right? So we released some research called false faces around synthetic IDs that we're seeing. And that was, one of our researchers. In fact, he's not actually a researcher. He's one of our consultants, right, who does a lot of our consulting based in the US. And he thought he'd dabble with it. It took him less than an hour. Actually, I think it was 70 minutes, sorry. He'd never played with it before. He'd never played with software before. Was able to do it on fairly standard hardware as well. And he was able to create face swapping. So I sort of showed that video, which was him going from a real human into him going to a face-swapped human. There's some techniques to be able to determine and see some of those things now. But again, I expect they'll also fade over time. So sort of moving hands in front of faces actually allows you to see the face behind and things like that. But in a world where we remotely recruit and remotely employ people, like this is worrying.
Yeah, really concerning. And how's the role of ransomware been evolving? This sort of extortion's been around in varying forms, but these things don't tend to sit still. There's always changes going on.
No, look, I think at a very high level, the basics. If you rebound back 10 to 15 years ago, ransomware. They were targeting individuals. They were trying to get a couple of $100 a go. We're now into major organisations and multi-extortion tactics as well, right? And major claims, $50 million or whatever it is, right, for the extortion they're trying to go after. But it's not just a case of, I think we sort of think about it. They were encrypting data. Okay, great, effective. What was good was industry got better at doing its backups, right? So then they moved to data exfiltration in combination with, encrypting data and so on and so forth into, the third level we started to see organisations being DDoS. The fourth level we started. So we continue to see these sort of iterative changes as to how they apply some of their sort of, I guess, pressure tactics, if you will do. One of the interesting points for me too is I sort of mentioned it earlier on, we do sort of a lot of deep and dark web monitoring the forums. We publish research fairly frequently on what are we seeing from the ransomware and extortion groups. I like that research because it's not necessarily about who's our customer base or where did we do our IR, but it's kind of what are threat actors telling you about themselves, right? From our reporting earlier this year, which again, it's published reporting, but a couple of key trends that we saw there were it's exaggerated claims, but I kind of think about that as threat actors lie. I mean, no major surprise, right?
Yeah.
But they're sometimes using fake and old data in these forums, right? And they're claiming that they've broken into an organisation, but it's not necessarily the case. So one of the good uses of I think our negotiation team is to also help validate some of that claim as well, right? Validate, did that come from that organisation? Did that come from that organisation now, or did that come from that organisation 2 years ago? Knowing some of that sort of, that piece.
That's pretty key, isn't it? If you actually haven't been hit, but
absolutely,
you're trying to be extorted, and it's not actually real. Then you want to get your head around that pretty swiftly.
Absolutely, like the pain ultimately that organisations go through when they have a cyber incident. from everybody at the operational level right through executives, boards and partners and everybody else around that. You want to know pretty quickly whether it's, true or otherwise. But I think some of the other sort of key things we saw were we've started to see a bit more blurring between some of the sort of APT and ransomware groups. We have seen what looks like some shared infrastructure between, some of the North Korean nation-state groups and also some of the sort of more ransomware or, I guess, revenue-generating groups, shall we say. We've also seen a lot of talk on some of the sort of the forums from the affiliate groups about the use of things like EDR killers, which to me is a bit more of a concern because once they're discussing how great these tools are, and I think there's been a heavy reliance on endpoint detection. If that's where you're sort of relying things, and now there's tools to sort of bypass quite easily. That would be a concern, and I think they're probably some of the main things that really stood out for us when we're looking at some of the trends and the changes in those groups.
Yep. And how big is the role of social engineering now, sort of, I guess, beyond the traditional, phishing type of attacks and, dodgy emails of the past?
Yeah, look, it's definitely changed, which is, a number of months ago now, we actually released a social engineering report as a sort of an addendum, if you will, due to our IR report released earlier in the year. And look, social engineering, as you said, phishing has usually been one of the number one attack vectors, but social engineering as a whole is kind of the number one attack vector, right? I think it was something like 36% of the cases that we investigated overall were initiated through social engineering. As we said, it's not just phishing anymore. It is starting to move into more of that sort of, I guess, help desk manipulation. So targeting of, help desk call centers and trying to manipulate them into giving away, multi-factor access and those sorts of things. So it's really around trying to get that access. But we also see things like social engineering around trying to get, obviously search engine optimization, so poisoning of those to increase, I guess, ultimately the results that people are receiving when they're looking at things.
Right. So someone's Googling away. They think, well, I can trust Google to give me, trustworthy links. I'd never question that if it's, if it's up there on the first page of Google, then it's likely, trustworthy. And in
That's
fact,
right.
most people probably wouldn't give it a second thought. But we're seeing the threat actors actually manage to insert results in there, and I guess if that happens, then a similar thing could happen with Gen AI type systems as well, right? If they can get into Google results, they can get into Gen AI results, and I've noticed that sort of thing can happen very quickly. I was involved in something in the last few months where a new domain name was purchased, new content was put online, and it got to ranking number one on Google it was ranking on the first page within a bit over a week, and number one on Google on multiple searches within 2 to 4 weeks. Now, this one was legitimate content, but the fact that can happen,
Exactly.
gives a little bit of an understanding of what someone who can get some serious benefit out of ranking can do, right? And then there's the malvertising
Yes, absolutely.
side where, maybe they're using stolen credit card details, or they've hacked into accounts to run ads, or maybe they're legitimately paying for the ads. I don't know. But we're seeing that as part of the picture as well, aren't we?
Absolutely. There's a whole range of those sort of techniques, right? Even compromising legitimate websites, right, and serving up malicious content through that as well. And, these sorts of things, unfortunately, just are not uncommon. And again, part of the reason we sort of released that report was because, even if I look at, we spoke a bit about ClickFix in the report, right, and ClickFix is sort of that, fake user prompt, click this because, it looks like a system update, right? It looks like something I need to do. And ultimately, users very much we've trained users to be like, keep your software up to date, keep yourself protected. So it's not a surprise, but I remember seeing sort of probably around mid-March, we really saw an uptick in that sort of tactic that we were seeing. And again, it's a form of social engineering. It's trying to bypass human or identity flaws in systems. It's trying to take advantage of, human trust ultimately, right?
Now, you mentioned around, targeting a help desk. Is this something that is quite common now? And what would be the approach that an organisation needs to take if they've got, and I'm sure across our listeners, there'll be people with varying sort of relationships or roles in relation to, say, an internal or an external help desk. What's the guidance that you can give in terms of making sure help desks aren't opening the door to cyber attack?
Look, I think it's a number of things when we sort of do our investigations, and look, it's not just help desks. I've sort of said it a few times. Call centers, similar sorts of functions, I guess, if you will, do that have access to information or access to credentials and resets and these sorts of things, but really, like, what do they need to do? So it probably a range of different things. I think we've spoken about for extended periods of time around, things like training and awareness. Often that tends to focus on phishing. Don't click here. But actually we need to, be more sort of targeted in some of that. And I know a lot of organisations have been for the likes of help desk, but again, it almost needs to be real world simulations of what are we seeing again, how are we seeing those threat actors evolve, and are we testing and educating that group of users on those types of changes, right? So here's what we're now seeing. Here's how these things have evolved. So there's that sort of, general sort of awareness piece, and that's one aspect. But, it really is a case of exploiting things like the gaps in almost like identity systems, right? Or the human workflow itself. So again, breaking down those things. What are the lessons learned that we're getting in these cases, and therefore what are those controls? And, I fundamentally think that plug in with, how we're looking at identities and how we're looking at, you're probably very familiar with the zero trust principles, right? How are we going to be sort of validating, users and devices and applications on an ongoing basis? Or how do we sort of give just-in-time access? So only access for when it's explicitly needed and not permanent access to things. So a range of different controls, I think, across, and that's how we always need to look at security, right? A range of different controls to give the outcome.
Yeah, and it's a good reminder. These things aren't super simple.
No.
And what was relevant 12 months ago is going to be different today, and that will keep happening, won't it?
Yeah, definitely. I think we always still need to learn from what happened previously, because threat actors will pivot back to old techniques as well. But again, what is happening now, and what are we foreseeing to happen, and how do we plan for some of those sorts of things?
And how do you see that the landscape has changed with the organisations that you work with? How quickly do they organisations getting to the places where they need to be? Are you seeing big leaps forward, or have we still got quite significant challenges in terms of the maturity of organisations, in terms of how they're going with reducing those internal risks from a cyber perspective? Of course, there's so many aspects into
That's right, yeah.
into that, but what's your sort of general feeling of how are we doing overall?
I think look, there's no one size fits all in this answer, right? Different organisations are at different stages, different industries. Some are more heavily regulated, so they've been working on security challenges much longer. So I think, and some are less able to move so quickly because they've got environments that only get changed ever so frequently. It's not like they can just roll out updates all of the time and these sorts of things. So like I said, there is that sort of change. But my view is we can't keep doing what we used to do. That has to change. And, that is, one of the things that I probably most enjoy about working at Palo Alto Networks is that view of how do we need to keep doing things differently? How do we need to keep innovating? And that's where the research piece comes into it so much for me. What do we know? What do we know is starting to happen? Where do we know things are going to? And therefore, what do we need to change? And, we're just, as I said earlier, we're at our conference during the week and we had our president of Cortex over here, Shailesh, and he was speaking. And I kind of, it's the first time I've seen him present and I was super impressed. But he said to the audience, I'm giving you the answer. You go away and work out how to question it and test it and this sort of stuff. And his view was, here's what is supposedly a modern SOC looks like. He said, we need to stop trying to operate in the way that we do for security operations. Like, we can't keep being human-centered. We've got too much information. We've got too much complexity. We've got too many things not talking to each other. We've got all these challenges, and we need to get past that. And so I genuinely believe that is the thing. We can't keep trying to run security operations with a new rule and a new rule and a new rule every time a threat evolves or there's a new IOC or file hash or an IP. Like, that just doesn't work. So I think it's any organisation out there, we need to start thinking about how do we test ourselves to be, particularly when we talk about AI threat. As I've said, the speed and scale has increased, and it's to a point where that's almost no time to react. We can't rely, unfortunately, on humans being our first line of defence, at least.
Yeah, that's really wise, and I think there is so much that can be leveraged from an automation and an AI perspective, especially. And if you're trying to manually set all those things up, you're always going to be chasing your tail. So we definitely need to be leaning in and leveraging these things. And I think probably everyone listening has hopefully come away with something that's got them thinking about something that maybe they weren't thinking about previously, or that's it's just giving them a little bit of a nudge of, oh yes, we need to keep moving along in one area or another, because I don't think there's probably any organisation that can be relaxed about cybersecurity. We need to keep moving things forwards.
Absolutely.
Well, that's great. It's been fantastic to chat with you. Anything else that you wanted to add that we've maybe missed, Philippa?
I don't think so. I could obviously talk security all day, but look, thank you, Paul, for having me. It's been great to talk to you, and also I hope it's of value to your viewers, like you said.
Yeah, super insightful, and thanks for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody, for listening in. We'll look forward to catching you on the next episode. Of course, a big thank you also to our show partners, to Workday, 1NZ, 2 Degrees, Spark, HP, and Gorilla Technology. Thanks, everyone. Catch you next time.
The New Zealand Tech Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, proactive and strategic IT.